Welcome to the Robyn Boyd Foundation's Design Matters series. Frances Burke was Australia's most influential and celebrated textile designer of the 20th century. From the late 1930s to 1970, her designs achieved a prominence unparalleled in Australia before or since. Displaying imagery and colours of native flora, marine objects, Indigenous artefacts and pure abstraction, Burke's innovative fabrics remain fresh and appealing. Burke was the first Australian designer to receive an MBE. She was the sole woman foundation member of the Society of Designers for Industry in 1948 and a board member of the pioneering Museum of Modern Art and Design in Melbourne. Joining us in conversation is Dr. Nanette Carter, a design historian at the School of Design and Architecture at Swinburne University, and Robyn Oswald-Jacobs, an independent scholar and graduate of the Textile Design program at RMIT University. Robyn Oswald-Jacobs completed research master's degree on the career of Frances Burke. This project led to the establishment of the Textile Resource Collection, Australian Fashion and Textile Design, which was the foundation for RMIT University's Design Archives. Nanette and Robyn shared the Redmond Barry Fellowship awarded by the State Library of Victoria and the University of Melbourne for their research into Frances Burke.
Thank you, Jamie. We've been looking forward to presenting here tonight. We really have enjoyed the relationships that Frances Burke had with various architects of her day. But to start, I'm going to read from a book that may be familiar to you by now. And since we've not committed it to memory, we thought they're excellent words. Why not read them? So we are. So this is to cite Frances Burke so that you've got somebody to imagine while we talk about her life and work. So, designer and businesswoman Frances Burke was a dynamic, feisty person, articulate, with a resonant, commanding voice, distinctive enunciation, and a unique way of expressing herself. Her bright blue eyes focused directly on those around her, and her diminutive height, with her light blonde hair invariably styled in a French roll, was her sort of presentation. She was always elegantly dressed and was excessively fond of hats. She had a zest for life, loved her chosen career, was good company and a loyal friend. And Anne Purvis from the Australian Galleries said of her that she was extreme, something of a legend, but she mellowed. And Marjorie Tipping, another friend, remembered her as a fascinating character who nevertheless could be difficult. Not a lot was readily disclosed. She kept a lot to herself. But confident in her sexuality, she was described by Philip Jones, the bookseller, as chic and almost out. So she lived with her companion Phoebe Chamberlain for 67 years, and they never described themselves as partners. I met both of them and interviewed them over a fair period of time to put my masters together, but they were always very discreet about their companionship, as they called it. So there's Frances. She's in the studio. She's painting a screen where most of us would be dressed in some sort of old paint-spattered shirt or an apron of some sort. She had her good suit on and she had her pearls and hat. So she was born in 1904 and did nursing before she decided that with the small inheritance that her mother had left each of her two siblings and herself, that she would go to art school. So initially she went to the National Gallery School, which was located in that very small building on the left-hand side of the right-hand picture. So the side of the State Library, boiling hot in summer, freezing cold in winter, but it was a ferment of difficulty at the time if you happened to have a slightly renegade nature like Frances. So they spent the day drawing from plaster casts, and you didn't graduate from foot to hand until you had foot really in the bag. So Frances spent a year or so there, and then quickly whipped across the road to Building 2 at RMIT, where she trained with Napier Waller to learn about lino printing, and then ultimately also at RMIT about screen printing. Building 2 still looks pretty much the same. It's got a bit more of a creeper on it, and many years later I also trained there. So it's had a fine tradition, Frances Burke et moi. So probably the most cataclysmic thing she did was to train also with George Bell, who taught her about colour and shape and feeling. And she went on painting with George Bell long after he and Arnold Shaw had disbanded their school and moved out of the city of Melbourne, George to Selborne Road in Toorak, where Frances attended the Thursday Club of painters that was fairly, sort of specialist sort of group of painters.
Russell Drysdale was another fellow student, Peter Purvis Smith.
May Casey, when she was in Australia, various others. So from George Bell, Frances said she learned about colour, and Nanette and I both think that the seahorse design on the right-hand side of the screen now is an accomplished, very early design of Frances Burke's. Unusual colours and great movement, and she clearly went on enjoying George Bell's influence.
And in particular, she thought he had a big influence on her sense of colour.
Indeed, the colour and the... Yeah. So what we'd also like to say before I just hand over to Nanette to talk is that design did matter to Frances Burke. After she'd been through the National Gallery School, RMIT and the George Bell School, she made a very definite decision in favour of design. She decided that she wasn't going to be able to earn a living as an artist, selling one painting every now and again. And also she had a much more committed decision that people in general should be allowed to to enjoy her work, so that if she printed it on fabric, they had far more of a chance of doing so than if she made framed artwork and sold it. So the design matter part of it was really interesting because, as you'll see from the book, she almost did a SWOT exercise on herself in about 1936. So she looked at her strengths and her weaknesses and her opportunities and her threats, and she seized the moment. And she had a lifetime in design, which, as you'll see, was really quite exciting. So we're keeping you awake by swapping between us two.
So Frances often said that she was encouraged to go into fabric printing by Pierre Fornari, who was the fashion director at George's department store. So some of you of my age and older will remember George's as a wonderful department store with wonderful display. So Pierre Fornari was interviewed in 1937, and this is the wonderful thing of Trove, which is a search engine established by the National Library. For years, I remember when I was researching Frances Burke for a small section of my master's, I was looking for the article. She said that he was interviewed and he said that Australian designers should be inspired by Indigenous culture and the sort of colours that Indigenous artists were using. And in that, of course, he would probably referring mostly to bark paintings. But so I could never find it. I did look through, spend some time looking for it. But of course, with Trove now, Robyn and I were talking early on, and I said, if only we had that article. And I said, oh, well, I should do a Trove. And it came up like that. And so the original article of him saying exactly what he said about. And apparently she was encouraged by this. She read it in the Herald, and so she made an appointment, went in to see him with some drawings and some paintings on fabric. And he did commission her to do a length of fabric. They gave her 60 metres of fabric. And so then she brought it back, and with a fellow Melbourne Technical College student, they printed it up, and it was a disaster. It didn't work. and apparently the cat walked over it as well while it was still damp. So she had to run around and buy another 60 yards of the same sort of fabric. But, you know, they weren't deterred, and they went on to consult an industrial chemist about what to do. And initially, the fabric was used for what were referred to as a few glamour garments that went into the George's windows. But apparently, she, even though she didn't have heaps of money, she did go to George's and get some of her clothes made, probably because she was quite small and had trouble getting things off the rack. And so one of the women who was fitting her said that she hoped that why didn't she sell some of her fabrics to them, to their department. And so she started with Morris Holloway, established a company they called Burway, and designing and printing fabrics, and they sold initially to George's, and you can see on this play modes they mention some of her work, some of her designs. So that was mostly initially for sportswear, for swimsuits, all in mostly printed on lino initially and using heavy Irish linen. So there were shorts and tops, beach coats, which is not really a thing these days, is it? And bags. So there was a lot of this sort of emphasis on sea designs, things to do with the sea and so on. So it was interesting. She did go on to do designs influenced by Indigenous culture, but early on the ones that were really picked up were either garden flowers and these sea images, and some other ones that I'll be talking about. So initially they were printing in the small loft apartment in East Melbourne that she shared with Faby, but then quite quickly they got a studio in Selborne Chambers, which is still there in Little Collins Street. And Robyn was really worried about this building being, they had their studio on the 6th floor, and she was thinking about them carrying up screens and bolts of fabric and so on. So I rushed in and early one day and had a look, and sure enough they had an original elevator. So they did have an elevator, but it must have been very difficult because clearly it was an office building, and we wondered why she was there, which was not really, you know, it was because most fabric and fashion-related stuff was, of course, up and down Flinders Lane. So one of the things I did was look at the Sands McDougall Directory for Melbourne, and of course and I had a look at who the main tenants were, and the main tenants were Chamberlain and somebody or other solicitors, and of course Chamberlain is her partner Faby's family name, so we figure there's a family connection, which is why they had that. On the right, the fabric design is called sea bits, so it's sort of representing things that have come up, been washed up on the shore. It's got the sort of little wave marks in the sand and so on. So within a year or so, Frances and Morris, with their Burway prints, started supplying my department store. This is Myer on the left from 1934, so shortly after it opened. And one of the things that became important with Frances's work was the influence of Pacific Island culture, particularly tapa cloths, and they became a strong element of the design in her work. And this was partly because there was a kind of increasing interest in all things Pacific in the 1930s in Australia. Part of it was there was an interest, a sort of parallel interest in the United States for all things Hawaiian, but also it was related to greater movement into and around the Pacific Islands by Australians. Early in the 20s, some very wealthy people went on cruises to the Pacific Islands, but with in the 30s, the Orient Line established a sort of a small fleet of boats, particularly ships, particularly aimed at just transporting sort of more middle-class passengers to destinations, basically to the UK and back, but via the Pacific Islands. And this is one of Frances's very clearly tapa-influenced designs on the left. And on the right, this is a program from 1939 Fashion Parade from Myer, and it refers to Frances Burke's fabrics designs being used, ones that were Polynesian influenced, as they've said there, but probably more This particular one on the left was also used in a George's garment. In that case, it was referred to as being influenced by a Melville Island tapa cloth. So this takes us into around 1940-41, and this is Frances Burke in her studio with some of her fabrics. The interesting thing is, of course, we get the Second World War starting up in 1939, and so people are becoming more interested in, exactly what is this nation, another sort of re-evaluation of, what is the nation we're fighting for and so on, and what is specific about Australia. Whereas there were a few people like Margaret Preston in the 20s who are looking at Indigenous art and culture and trying to incorporate it. And in literature, we get the Jindi Warrabaks trying to include Aboriginal words into poetry and so on. But it's really during the Second World War, 1940 onwards, that it becomes kind of more mainstream. And Frances Burke is very much part of this movement. This design on the left is dugong and snake, and you can see on the photograph on the right in the background there's another dugong. She used that motif again, but with boomerangs. So there's quite this sort of strong influence, and a lot of these motifs she saw in the collection of the museum in Swanston Street.
This double-page spread, again of sea-related motifs, is from Lines magazine, which was the Victorian Architectural Students Society magazine, in 1939. So not long after Frances Burke and Maurice Holloway established Burway Fabrics in 1937-38. And I'm going to read you part of what Robyn Boyd wrote, him at that stage being the convener of the Architectural Students Society. He says that one night Miss Burke packed a swatch of vivid samples and addressed the Architectural Students Society on the subject of fabric design, its aesthetic and technical aspects. The nature of the process permits fabrics custom printed for exclusive and particular jobs. Architects and interior decorators know and use these materials and are grateful for them, he wrote. And undoubtedly, it was a very strategic move on both their parts, Robyn Boyd's and Frances Burke's, because it did result in commissions, and it resulted also in the young architects of the time understanding the role that fabrics could play in a room sort of presentation, rather than just being a bit of fabric that somebody decided they might make into curtains. So the following slides show the different architectural commissions that were forthcoming. On the left is the newly refurbished sitting room at Erskine House in Lorne, which Buchan Laird and Buchan had undertaken and asked Frances to design fabric for. So she looked carefully, and I'm sure with their help too, at the other motifs being used in the room and produced the fabric below. And in smudges, which was another of the architectural students' communications, the little bouquet in the middle was the bouquet of the month for the development in Lorne, which Robyn and his various cohort completely approved. The whole of the column on the right-hand side of this piece is also, we won't read that, but it goes through and describes the rooms, the hotels, and the way that it was put together and how terrific it was. So Frances was on the way with architects that she got on well with and enjoyed working with. This one is a Roy Grounds development in Glover Court in Toorak. So if you whip up past South Yarra Tennis Club and up the hill, you'd be turning left after the tennis club into Glover Court. And the site that was chosen by Roy Grounds was a difficult site. It was north-facing and, as you see, pretty craggy, not completely flat. And he produced some quite contemporary units for bachelor and family use, and decided in his wisdom that the kitchens would be part of the living spaces and divided from the living spaces with curtains designed by Frances Burke. And so she designed Ranga, this fabric, for Roy, and the colour scheme, which doesn't come over, it comes over reasonably well in the photograph on the left, but it wasn't quite, the curtain wasn't quite as overpowering as it might look in that small photograph. Ranga was also taken up in other ways by David Jones and various other department stores of the time too. And Roy saw fit to bring some pieces of it home and pop them into his house, the Ramsay House, which he designed as a, well, not initially as a hideaway for himself and Betty, who at that stage, Betty Ramsay, married to Tom Ramsay. She and Roy became lovers in this perfect haven, which clings to the cliff in Mount Eliza. It was open a couple of weeks ago, and it really is, it's a joy. It's quite small, but hey, anybody would think that they were just so privileged to be able to live in it. It's a marvellous little nest, and it may be difficult to see the cushion on the Michael O'Connell fabric chair, but it's there. Another of the architects that Frances worked with was Guilford Bell, and Guilford at that stage had been retained by Reg Ansett, who decided that he would purchase Hayman Island as a very smart holiday resort for his various clients. And Guilford spent about 2 years on the island. He commissioned Frances to design the fabrics, and this marvellous sea piece on the right is what she produced from bags of shells and sponges that Guilford thoughtfully sent down on the plane. And she is recorded as saying that everybody said to me, what a marvellous thing to have to do. You would have had to go to Hayman Island to draw these things. She said, no, unfortunately, he sent them down on the plane. So, but what she produced, we think, is really one of her most marvellous designs. When you look at the fact that it's one colour and the amount of detail and movement that she was able to get into it was terrific. It was hung in the public spaces in Hayman Island, and the next image shows the cabins, which at that stage were along the beachfront, and she designed angelfish for the cabins. And there is an indication that she designed other fabrics too, but we haven't been able to...
starfish one.
Yes.
Yeah, but we haven't been able to find
No, not to verify them anyway. But thank you, Trove, for the things that we have been able to verify so far. This is the House of Tomorrow, which was a 1949 development of Robyn Boyd's with the assistance of Peter McIntyre and some of the students from the architectural course. And Robyn used Frances fabrics in this eye-wateringly smart contemporary presentation in the exhibition buildings of the House of Tomorrow. This fabric of Frances was called Wavy Stripe. And while it may not be obvious in the photos, we can vouch for the fact that it was there.
Yeah. It's on the bed cover at the top there.
Difficult to see though. And this lurking down in the bottom left corner is a cushion made in Moresque fabric, which is the fabric on the left. But Robyn obviously was not going to use anything that he didn't deem to be absolutely at the pointy end of furnishing, lighting and fabric. So there was Grant Featherston furniture, Clement Meadmore furniture, Becco lighting and Frances Burke fabrics.
So this is the Dunstan House, a house designed by Robyn Boyd, and apparently he also chose the colour schemes, the interesting sort of yellow and red for the ceiling and the couple of different blues and so on. He also encouraged the clients, Mr. and Mrs. Dunstan, to commission Grant Featherston to design specific furniture for the interior, both the chairs covered with a sort of aqua on the left and the living room chairs here on the right. And again, it's Frances Burke's wavy stripe fabric. So we can pretty much assume that he might have specified her fabric again in this, which was sort of like a total work of art in the sense of, the architect was given free rein to choose colours and encourage the commissioning of furniture as well. So Frances Burke continued to have connection to Robyn Boyd also through the small home service. So most of you would probably know that after the war there was a huge housing shortage. There was also limitations on the size of a house that you could build. In Victoria, it was until the end of 1952 you were only allowed to build a very small house, and so that's where we get the whole idea of this stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 houses, which is an idea which I think deserves some sort of consideration these days. The idea was with the small home service, people could go and choose from a range of different designs by architects. Robyn Boyd directed and commissioned various architects. The architects were paid something like £20 for a design, and then each time it was used they got an extra £5 or so. And it changed, gradually the fee went up. So Frances Burke, they also published a series of brochures, sometimes small pamphlets, but also brochures that people could, small booklets that people could take home and, learn about getting their house built and so on. And this was a full-page advertisement that she placed in one of those. So clearly she was supporting him as he was supporting her. The fabric on the right, I think... Staccato, yes. So you can see also in the post-war period she's moving into more sort of abstract, strongly abstract patterns. She, of course, did that one for the Lawn Hotel, but that was quite Erskine House. That was an early abstract. It's kind of quite in a category of its own, whereas, she increasingly moved on. So another Boyd and collaborators interior. This is for the Sunshine House that was in 1952 in the exhibition buildings, and this one was very shocking for its colours. Boyd wrote a really interesting article in The Age, and he said, of course the Sunshine House colours offend some. They offend because they are strong and determined and express a point of view instead of a neutral, timid evasion. So
he had a way with words, Robyn, as you all know.
Yeah. And you can see here another sort of sad representation of Frances Burke. There's the table on the far left, on the floor under the table. And these are some photographs taken by Peter McIntyre. So we're grateful for the photographs, but we really wish he'd done more at the time in 1952 to display the fabric. And then another one up here on the right. And again, underneath the table, it's the Wavy Stripe. In this beautiful chocolate colour, which sort of is quite stunning with all of the yellows and the pink and orange. So the colours, Peter McIntyre, when we interviewed him about this, he said that they used tip-top paints, and that was something that we were interested in. There was this sort of, because of the housing boom in the post-war period, there were quite a lot of paint suppliers started up and came into business and out of business. This is one that didn't last a long time, but he said they loved the paints because they were good quality and they were really intense colours. And you can see they had this booklet system where people could sort of flip through and it was sort of encouraged people to pick particular combinations of colours and kept certain ones away. But as you can see, there's sort of fairly full strength. And we found the Sydney Living Museums has a sort of almost mint copy of this book, which is a pity that it doesn't belong in a Melbourne situation, but anyway, it's glad that they've kept it. And here we have Melbourne architect Phyllis Murphy in the living room, and below is the John and Phyllis Murphy's studio. Most of you will probably know of them as restoration architects in the post-war period, but early
swimming centre.
But yeah, they did some really remarkable work early on. The swimming centre for the Olympics just down the road here. They also did a lot of at that point they were doing small houses as well. They didn't specifically recommend Frances Burke's fabrics, but you can see in their studio they have one of hers called The Hunt, and they used it themselves in their living room. So we think that they would have, and this particular pattern, tartan, is one of the ones, is on the one that they've chosen, although not in these particular colours. We talked to Phyllis and she said it was a sort of blue and green, and we have seen a small piece of it, but we have been unable to get a shot of that. Another interesting example of a Melbourne architect who was a supporter of Frances Burke's fabrics is Ernest Fuchs. On the right here, there's in his office with her curtain in her Shields fabric. And then again on the left, Eve Guy, who was a Melbourne journalist who wrote about housing and other issues for magazines. And she also had Shields fabric in her Beaumaris house there. And Harry Ernest was a really remarkable commercial architect, did a lot of commercial buildings in the post-war. I think Chelsea House is a very well-known one in Flemington Road in North Melbourne. That's the one near the hospitals with a sort of, it's a glass wall and it has blue glass panels. Most of you have probably driven past it. This is a 1965 interior of the Mono Pumps Company, which was in Mordialloc, and using Frances Burke's lunar fabric. We're not sure what colour that was originally. And a whole range of hospitals and architects of hospitals, particularly Stevenson and Turner. Originally Stevenson and Meldrum first used her fabrics in the Royal Melbourne Hospital's nursing home. Over 1,000 yards of fabric were sold for that. So each nurse's room had Frances Burke curtains and also the public areas. And then they continued to use them through, this one is the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Adelaide from 1959, I think, yeah, with her Pacifica design. And another person who specified her work was Dudley Peck, who specialised in commercial design for companies, for offices and factories. He fitted out the new craft factory in Port Melbourne, and the top right you can see the dining room. Is it the boardroom? Boardroom,
sliver of fabric.
Yeah, the sliver of, again, her Wavy Stripe fabric. And on the right is one of her really remarkable designs that we see. That's one of the ones that comes up again and again in a number of different colourways over a long period. So it's clearly very popular, called Crete. And again, it has that sort of sea film with a starfish and a shell design. So Frances, this is Frances on the left and Faby in London in the post-war period. So as soon as she could fly places, Frances decided to start travelling. She's itching to go abroad and to find out that she initially started going mostly to the United States, but she also then went on to go to England, to Scandinavia, through Asia and so on. She's very interested, and initially she was going overseas every year for the first 5 years, and then after that about every second year. When she came back, she was always interviewed by the local press about what she found, and she was quite clever. And you can, if you read the articles, she would change her story each time about what she was going to talk about. She would also give public lectures and lectures to various groups about what was new in design. She became very much a promoter of good modern design for the home. She was not only interested in things that look good, but also she was very strong on functionality and improving women's lives. One of her trips, she came back very early on. I think it was the first one, and said that she went around saying, the Australian housewife is disadvantaged and, has a terrible time, which was actually true in comparison to American women had the advantage of having electric washing machines, dishwashers.
Kettles with wooden handles that didn't burn them.
Yes, and refrigerators rather than ice boxes, which were still, pretty much about 50% of Melbourne homes in the late 40s. So on the right here is a promotional photograph from 1956 with her surf curtains and a fiberglass chair, Charles and Ray Eames chair that she had brought back from the United States, and also a lighting by Clement Meadmore. So she would do these settings to promote and support the other designers that she admired, and to sort of give a context for how people could understand how to use her fabrics and what sorts of things you could put them with.
So this is Frances' office and studio in Hardware Street in the city. It's in the part of Hardware Street that is between Little Burke Street and Lonsdale Street. It still exists. You could make a pilgrimage, because opposite is the wine bar that's on the corner of Little Burke and Hardware. And she also had rooms above the wine bar there, so it was a short step across the road. But this is the interior, which to us might not look wildly exciting, but on the left-hand side were the products that she deemed safe for the Australian housewife, or interesting for the housewives, with furniture also from Grant Featherston, Clement Meadmore and the Becco lighting. So they were the sort of triumvirate that she used. But interestingly, or particularly interestingly for us, on the right-hand side, the fabrics were displayed as if they were curtaining. So she didn't design for the fabrics to be hung flat on the wall. She designed for them to be quite big units of design within an interior that she encouraged people in her writing and talking to think about, to really think about the colours and the design that would enhance the room and would make it both welcoming and striking without overwhelming the space. So she wanted people to see how the fabric would look made into curtains, which sounds really simple, but it was something that she was particularly strong about. This was in 1947, and she opened and felt that in opening her retail outlet, it was she wished she'd done it 10 years earlier, meaning when she first started in business. However, probably it was a good thing that she hadn't. During the war, she enjoyed a monopoly. As she said, there's nothing so satisfying for a business person than to have a monopoly. And she came out of the war a well-known name in Melbourne. And in opening then her retail outlet, she was able to focus better her philosophy, or put together her philosophy on the unit design that was important to her. This was one of the advertisements that she placed. She was very good at advertisements. She understood the power of a well-designed ad, well placed for the reader. And in this one, she'd used a fabric called Totem, which pays some lip service to the Indigenous designs. This is also their ads for Anderson's. Anderson's stores had 7 outlets apart from the one in Chapel Street, and used her fabrics in their displays, and we assume encouraged their clients to also purchase them. The Descon one on the right also used the fabrics and used furniture from Hardware and also the Clement Meadmore furniture, often forgetting to apply for permission to do so. Frances also, though, was very sought after in terms of Australian Home Beautiful and Australian House and Garden, both of whom were kind to her in the sense of profiling her, and in this case, in many cases, giving her covers of the magazines. The one on the right is interesting. The house is an early Ivan Ivanov house. It was for a musician called Jack Harrison, who is the one with the black dog on the left-hand side of the image. It's in Perth, and it again used the Totem fabric. It looked out onto the sea in Cottesloe, so the fabric was well chosen in terms of the sea and sky colours. Another ad here, and on the right-hand side is one of 3 quite large boards that are in the National Gallery of Australia that have samples, colour samples of Frances' work. Underneath each of them, and you can read the names in the book, but she named each of her colours. When we first looked at them and thought we have to use them, the sticky tape sticking them all down and covering the names of the colours had yellowed. And the designers, the book designers, did a brilliant job cleaning that up and enabling us to use it. But colour was a particular thing for Frances. She said that it vibrates. It was joyous and it vibrated. So she felt colour right from that early days with the George Bell School, when he gave her the ability to look at colour in a different kind of a way than something that just filled itself in between a couple of lines, maybe. The panels are terrific. And talking of colour vibrating, this slide is an interesting one. The theatre on the left-hand side is the Canberra Civic Centre Theatre, which is part of the Civic Centre. There's a forecourt with a large pool and fountain and a statue by Tom Bass, and then you would walk into the theatre to be greeted with the fabric on the right called Black Opal. Roy Simpson was the designer of the Civic Centre as a whole, and he had selected for the theme for the different pieces that he wanted to bring together in the Civic Centre: earth, air, fire and water. And he had an extensive correspondence with Tom Bass, who was the designer of the sculpture called Ethos, which was in the forecourt of the theatre. And then there was the pool, as I mentioned, but the fact that this was called Black Opal and the theatre was sort of darkened underground, you would walk into it and there was these fiery orbs of colour, was really very exciting. And we've talked to people who had been there, and they said it was really, as a small child, or small children, they thought it was unbelievably exciting. These are two relatively contemporary installations of Frances' work. On the right, as you see the Australian National Gallery, the NGA has 180 odd pieces of Frances Burke's work. Here it's displayed the Ranga fabric that is from the Roy Grounds development in Glover Court in Toorak, the Schulman Crimper cabinet, and a large platter by Harold Hewen, Harold was a particularly close friend of Frances. On the left is a relatively recent installation at the Art Gallery of South Australia. By contrast to the National Gallery, they have 3 pieces of Frances Burke work, and they make sure that one or all of them are displayed at any one time. They have terrific installations, which, as you see, include furniture and paintings and ceramics, and so that they show the fabrics as Frances would have loved, except that they show them flat, but with other pieces, so forming a unified whole, which she would have completely approved. So we just want to read you something else to wind up. We decided that since Philip Goad had written such a brilliant foreword for our book and had been such a wonderful support, and without Philip we wouldn't have even entered the Redmond Barry Fellowship, let alone having been awarded it. We thought that we would let him give you the last word. So he says, in the pantheon of 20th century Australian design, Frances Burke stands tall. She was a major force, a brilliant designer, a technical innovator for her craft, and a champion for progressive textile design, not just for the home, but also for settings devoted to health, hospitality and community, and a supremely successful retailer and business owner. Internationally, she deserves to be better known. Her work can be placed alongside celebrated mid-century designers of printed fabrics, like the Austrian émigré Josef Frank for Spanx 10 in Sweden, in Stockholm, Alexander Girard for Herman Miller in the USA, and the one I always trip up on, Vuoko Nurmesniemi and Maya Isola for Marimekko. But we have to say that Frances Burke preceded them all. Joseph Frank was designing textiles between 41 and 46. The Girard and Herman Miller collaboration was about 1952, and the Marimekko illustration was about 1951. And as you'll remember, Frances Burke set up in business in 1937, and the cover of the book she produced was in her, this fabric, tiger stripe, was in her folio of designs for 30 years. So each of her designs came out of her head, were drawn by her, and were applied to fabric and then marketed and retailed, sold, talked about in a very intelligent way. She certainly was an amazing person to meet, even when she was older and her energy had somewhat, and the light had dimmed a bit. She was still a very interesting person. And I, as a textile designer, loved it and was delighted when Nanette said that she said, in a nanosecond, I said, think about a collaboration on a book about Frances Burke. And she said, yes. I said, no, think about it. She said, I don't need to. So we went from the coffee shop across the road to Swinburne and drew up the plan for the book, and here it is. Thank you, MUP.